thanks for joining our webinar today, all about printing on Moab's Moenkopi papers, the Unryu and Kozo. We have Evan Parker, Moab's technical specialist, and Les Picker, a Moab master, photographer, and educator. So thank you both for joining us. Today we'll cover when to use Moenkopi Unryu and Kozo printing, all printing tips and how to display your finished prints on these papers. Les Picker is also the author of an ebook called The Art of Fine Art Digital Printing, a guide to everything you need to know about printing. It's free to download, and he includes a series of case studies on the website. One in particular is all about printing on Moab, Moenkopi Unryu. So I'll include a link to both where you can download that and the case study in the chat if you want to check it out. And Les, can you just give a quick overview on the Substack?
Yeah, we have a Substack newsletter that is devoted specifically to printmaking. So if you're at all interested in printing, you're thinking about getting into printing, you're a beginning printer or an advanced printer, we have a really wonderful community that is very active and passionate about printing. So come on, joining is free. So enjoy it. We'll put up that link later on. Is that right, Paige?
I'm going to put it in the chat so everyone can find all these links. Yep.
Okay, good. Sounds good.
So I'm going to pass it off to Evan and Les to get started.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We wanted to look at the Moenkopi papers for two main reasons. Number one, they're really unique and interesting and an unusual tool for presenting your photography. And second, I think some people are kind of intimidated by them because they're not traditional papers. They're not something that you would have printed on in the past. And so they can be a bit unnerving if you want to get started, because you say, well, I don't know what to print on that, or I don't know how I'm going to use it, or how do I display it, or all those other things. So our goal today is to give you a foundation for these two really impressive papers and some direction so that you can pick up the Moenkopi sample box or even the Moab sample box has both of these papers in it, and have an idea of how you're going to use them to forward your creative endeavors in photography. So there's many unique aspects for these papers, but to kind of kick it off, they're both from the Awagami mill in Japan. They are traditional Kozo or mulberry fiber papers. The Unryu is 55 GSM, so it's an extremely thin, somewhat translucent paper. If we actually look at it in the swatch book, you can see that you can, in fact, if you overlay it, you can see through it. And I know Les has used that to his advantage in some presentations. The Kozo is a little thicker, a little heavier. It's still a little translucent, not as much as the Unryu. But the biggest difference that's apparent right away is the Unryu is a long fiber paper. So you have these really interesting longer paper fibers that are sort of randomly placed throughout the sheet, whereas the Kozo is a short fiber, and that has a much more uniform surface that we're used to, similar to what you'd see in the Entrada or another cotton paper, albeit with a different surface finish, and then obviously that thinner, more translucent look to it. So there are two really interesting papers that kind of push the boundaries of what we can do with inkjet printing, and they offer a lot of sort of more unique uses and unique offerings to give your work a really interesting look. And Les, I don't know if you have other introductory ideas about that.
Sure, I'll just sort of reinforce what you said in some cases here. The two papers are very different. I have to say that right off the bat. They would have different applications perhaps, but they are different. And the Kozo in particular, which we'll get into, is in a way can be used as a matte paper, but if you need a softer feel, we'll get into that in more detail once we focus on the Kozo paper itself. But the key thing I want to just emphasize is that it has a much softer feel than, for example, Entrada Natural or Entrada Bright, which is our go-to paper in our studio, the go-to papers in our studio, and the new textured entradas. So that's the overview that I'll do. Once we get into each paper, I'll be more specific.
Yeah. So another another big piece is, and you alluded to it, when do we use these? How do we use these? So I would completely agree that the Kozo is a really interesting, describing paper surfaces on camera is can be a little difficult. It's like talking about music or something. But to me, it's more of almost a subtle ethereal surface. It can give your photos either kind of a dreamy look or more of a subtle, really almost painterly, not in the sense of maybe watercolor where you'd see less detail or something like that, but a really soft, traditional fine art, different look. And then, of course, with the Unryu, it has similar characteristics to the Kozo in the softer surface, the real subtle look, but then again, you have those fibers. I think a couple things to be just conscious of when you're looking at both of these is compared to a cotton paper or a traditional photo paper, they will have a little lighter black point, so you're not going to get quite as deep of a black. They do have a slightly smaller gamut, so you're not going to get all of the colors you would get on a Barita or another glossy or even an Entrada photo paper. But the point of these papers is not like faithful photographic reproduction with the most colors, the most saturation, everything else. We're really using them as an art tool, kind of accentuating certain things that then it doesn't necessarily matter as much that there may be a few trade-offs. But if you go in printing these thinking, oh, it's going to look just like the Juniper or the Entrada, it isn't. And we don't want you to be disappointed right off the bat and say, well, what happened? Well, those are some of the inherent properties of the sheets themselves.
It's an important point to make on that, Evan, is that, we teach printing in workshops, and people are often disappointed when they go from a monitor to a print, whether it be Entrada, Moab Entrada, or any of the other great papers that are out there. But it's an art form. It's different than monitor art. You're dealing with a print, and it takes some getting used to. And that's very true with these Moenkopi papers, that you have to really look at it as an art form that essentially you have to work at matching the right image to that paper. And that's something, the contrast, as you said, is not as harsh. It's good for images if you want a softer feel, especially with the Kozo. I feel a little differently. In our studio, we feel differently about Unryu, but we'll get to that specifically. I want to stay with Kozo for a minute. One often ignored issue is that at 110 GSM, it's really, really good for mounting. Like if you have a 300 or 325 GSM, mounting can be an issue.
Yeah, it adheres to lots of things. It breathes well. You just also then need to make sure that your mounting substrate matches the paper, because again, with that translucent, you wouldn't want to use necessarily maybe a warm light backer board or something, because that's going to show through in the print.
Do you use traditional printer profiles for these papers?
So we offer ICC profiles for these papers the same way we do the rest of the line.
Let me interrupt there and say that the profiles that, and I'm not doing this for to appeal to Evan, but the fact is that Evan does damn good ICC profiles, and they're spot on. We don't have to go into custom profiles. We just use the profiles that come out of Evan's shop.
Thank you. It's something we endeavor to do the best we can on. So it's been really fun.
So in terms of going back to the Kozo, it has a fine texture. Like Evan said, it's a short fiber, so it's a finer texture than the Unryu, if you will, and a very pleasing one. We proof it basically against Entrada Natural, because we know how an image should look on Entrada Natural, because it's our go-to paper, that and bright. So if you want a softer feel and a more subtle, the D-Max is restricted. The blacks are not really true blacks. It's difficult to get a hard black without affecting the rest of the image. But if you want a softer presentation, not a poppy, in other words, if I were at the Albuquerque Balloon Festival, I probably wouldn't print it on Moenkopi Kozo. I would look for an Entrada paper or something. So if you want a softer feel, then I think it works. And Evan, if you want to show that one of the leaves, I can talk through that.
In terms of generic profiles, does the ultra premium presentation mat work for this?
It all depends on what printer you have. So once you download our profiles, there's an accompanying PDF of all the media settings. So based on your printer model, if it's an Epson, it's a possibility that we used ultra premium matte. But if it's a Canon, generally we use a washy media setting. On the newer Epsons, we also use a washy media setting. So check the website for your printer, and that'll give you the media setting that you need.
Okay, so going back to the Kozo, this is an image that of decaying leaves in Hawaii. I didn't want it to be poppy. I didn't feel comfortable with the reds being very bright. I wanted more of a Zen, sort of softer feel for it. Evan, I think there's also a close-up there.
Yes.
Of the paper. So you can see it very well, but in the lower right side, you can see that really sweet texture. It's not overpowering. We tend to exhibit both Kozo and Unryu in an open frame. We don't put it behind glass because we feel that there's the texture itself and the paper qualities really call out for a more intimate experience between the viewer and the artist. So there's an example of how we would use Kozo in this. We're looking for a softer feel on a really nicely textured paper.
Yeah, it's lovely. Excellent choice. And again, here you're using this for aesthetic reasons, right? You have an image that lends itself really well to this medium and this display, and it really, because of the not glazing and the texture and that subtle surface, it really draws you in when it's presented. I think you linger on it a lot longer than you would have if it was on a Baryta or some other more traditional paper, where it just doesn't have that same feel to you as the viewer.
I would agree. I mean, we've printed this on Juniper. We've printed it on Entrada Natural. Entrada Natural can get pretty close, but this we just liked the way it presented here. So we went with it, and people do spend a lot more time on it. They're really curious about. You see them poking their faces very close to the print to try to figure, especially if they're experienced photographers and printers.
And that's what I always go back to when we talk about paper is the opportunity you have to give so much information to the viewer and really guide them simply by selecting the paper that your image goes on, right? You can say a whole lot that is not necessarily present in the photograph or anything else, but you're saying all that to the viewer just with the medium you choose. So especially with these papers, you really send somebody in a specific direction just with the paper before you even put any ink on it.
Yes, and we get a lot of questions about it at our workshops, and people then tend to buy the Kozo and Unryu because they see what its potential is, and they go back and try it. Now it takes some work, and you have to practice on it, but since this paper is a little bit pricier than some other papers, we recommend printing first on a paper that you know. So we always print first on Entrada, and then we can extrapolate how we think it will look on. So it minimizes the failures, and really that's how we work with any paper. We always start with our Entrada as the base unit, because we know it so well.
And it's double-sided, so you got two opportunities on every sheet.
You're darn right, we need it.
If you don't present this behind glass, how do you protect the print?
Well, that's a good question. Kozo can tolerate the Moab desert spray, so you can coat it and with a couple of coats of desert spray, and that works fine. You don't want to display any print with direct sunlight hitting it, so that's always we do workshops on actual displaying your images, and that's one thing that I think people ignore. The image, the print looks great in the studio, but then they hang it on their wall, and in 6 months, if there's a lot of sunshine on it, there's going to be some reaction. Whether it's even you have to put it behind museum quality glass or a high quality UV glass if you're going to glaze it. But we do glaze our Moab papers but with the Unryu Kozo, we don't. We tend to make those open frame. It's just a choice we make, and people who buy our prints understand that. We tell them that they have to be careful about not having it in direct light.
And you're also varnishing the Unryu, or not so much?
Well, we can varnish the Unryu. Anything that's displayed in our studio, we don't, because it's a protected environment. There are no windows, so it works well, and we haven't noticed any degradation in the image. But if it's going to go out, then we discuss it with the client, and we determine it can be sprayed. That's the basic point,
right?
That you're getting at, yeah.
Yeah. So basically,
we do not recommend some of the sprays that you can get on the internet for half the price of others. They absolutely can ruin your print. And we've done testing on it over a dozen different sprays over the years. But we always go back to the Moab Desert Spray, and there are two other brands that we feel are very similar. But you're always secure with the Desert Spray.
Yeah, whatever you're using as a protectant spray, you have to make sure that it's for inkjet prints specifically, because you'll see a lot of sprays that are archival for painting or pastels or charcoals or things like that. And those typically have solvents in them that don't affect those pigments in those materials, but those solvents can have devastating effects on inkjet inks. So you do absolutely have to make sure that you're using the desert varnish or some other inkjet specific spray for sure. But yeah, that is the best way to protect these if you're not going to glaze them, to give them some. Because the thing that I always want to translate is, if you're, especially like you, Les, if you're selling prints, either you're going to have that in-depth conversation with your customer, or if you're not able to do that, you want to kind of set them up for success, right? You maybe put a little card in there that says this does not have glazing in it, to feature the paper as prominently as possible. As a result, we recommend that you don't hang this anywhere where it gets direct sunlight or things like that, right? You want to translate to your customer that this is a delicate object, and they can't just hang it anywhere they want in their house, or if they do, they have to come to terms with the fact that it may not remain unchanged forever if it's getting sunlight 3, 4, 5 hours a day.
Yes, and Evan, we have to dispel the myth that putting just cheap glass over the print is going to be protective. It is not. Yeah. Thin, inexpensive glazing actually offers very little to no protection. You have to have UV protection anyway, minimum. But then again, that can change the look of your print. Having the UV light can change the way the print looks. So you have to be careful with that, and the light you put on it.
Yeah. So you're saying more experimentation and more learning. Yeah.
Got it.
Exactly. So let's drill down a little bit into more specific tips when you're using each one of these papers. I think that we've kind of touched on a few things. The Kozo, it's a little more of a subtle paper, so to keep that in mind. The Unryu, of course, has the long fibers. So especially if you're doing portraiture, that can be a challenge. Unryu is something that maybe you put a portrait on, but more likely you're going to put an environmental portrait on it where the subject is small and the background is much more key to the image. But then do keep in mind that these fibers are random. So this sheet is not going to match another sheet, is not going to match a different sheet. So if you have a photo that you absolutely want to print on the Unryu, but you know where your subject is, you can pick a sheet that has a smoother area where that key point is, and then you still retain the fibers around the outside. But with that said, Les, how do you approach working with these two papers, image preparation, considerations, that sort of thing?
Yes, I think you mentioned a good one is the fibers in the Unryu. So let me just talk about that for a minute. And I want to say before we even start that these are not for highly bright, saturated images.
Right.
You really have to take a very artistic approach to it, which is a lot of fun, by the way, and very the artistic results can be striking. So the Unryu, it really depends on the size of the image. You have to understand that the fibers don't change in the image in the paper. They're big fibers. So the smaller your print is, the more obvious and impactful the fibers will be. So we find, this is a tip, is that it tends to work better on larger images so that there's space for those fibers to have their impact. So they can be a distraction in smaller prints, but I've done small prints with them with the right image, and it even in a holiday card that I send out, a little insert, and that holiday card is printed on Unryu, but it is the image is right for that. So negative space with Unryu, with these embedded fibers. If your image has a lot of negative space, it looks terrific because it emphasizes the subject and the lush fibers. But but it can even work. We did a 40 by 60 image for an exhibition of an animal, and we never thought it would work well on Unryu. But as we worked it up, we realized that it really helped the fur to stand out beautifully. So we were very happy with the result. Can you show the image from? Well, this is the large of a coyote taken in Canada, and the fibers were just terrific in the fur. We thought it wouldn't work quite as well, but yeah, there's a good close up of it. Those fibers, yeah. Really, and they're translucent, so if you have the right lighting and a little bit of backlighting tipped over the image, it really is a standout presentation. I have to say that. All right, can you go to the one that shows Chris Jewett's image?
The
Nope.
leaf for the
tea
teapot.
kettle.
Yes.
Okay. So here's an example. This is one of my clients, but independently a phenomenal light painting photographer, and I purchased this from him because I think it's so wonderfully done. This is printed on Unryu, and again, I want to emphasize that the use of negative space around that kettle and in the dark tabletop, really, it's like a made for Unryu image, for the Unryu paper. The fibers really add to the artistic intent, and I think it's a real win. If you can show the other one, and yeah, you can see here, good, the close up of all those fibers and how they add to the image. Can you show the one of the branch? So this is a more elaborate presentation. Again, no glazing on it, and this is just shows again how negative space around your subject adds. It's a softer approach. It's you know, this is black and white, so the Dmax wasn't quite as critical, but having all those fibers in the negative space adds, at least from what I was intending, adds to the artistic impact of the image.
So what are the specific considerations that you look at if you're going to do a black and white image on these papers?
Well, for Unryu, again, I don't want the fibers to distract from the image. For example, if it's, I wouldn't, personally, I would not do a portrait, a human portrait on there, because it really, really can have a horrible effect on the skin. Even if you try to print it in a way that avoids some of the fibers, they end up distracting in the photo anyway. And people are very, very fussy about their skin tone and their complexion and so on. So
Right.
it doesn't, for me, it would not work there. So that would be eliminated. A environmental scene that's somewhat complex, maybe not necessarily. It wouldn't perhaps work quite as well. A good portrait, a close-up portrait of an elephant or of a lion, sure, that work the fur. Yeah, there you go.
Mhm.
It really shows up in the fur. It's hard to see it on camera,
Yeah.
but when you see it in person, it's quite striking.
Yeah. Or a situation here where you have a lot of background that really mimics those fibers, right? This is a slam dunk for the Unryu because you have the fine grasses in the background, you have the fibers in the background. You know, to me, this is the quintessential image because it puts you in that place, right? You almost feel as though you're right back in that scene, watching that cub watch you.
Yeah, but it can't be the quintessential image because it's not mine.
So one of our guests is asking, what about an image that has black negative space? Have you ever done something with a really dark background? I guess similar to the tea kettle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the tea kettle is a perfect example. It's dark negative space, and it just blows away because the light shined on that, you shine on it, whatever your exhibition lighting is, pick up the fibers differently than the base paper. So you see that in some cases it's very shiny in the upper left, and other cases it comes out dark, and it really is. I wish you could see that in person. People spend so much time. And Chris, I got to give Chris Jewett a nod. Hats off to him because he works like crazy to get these images just right. Takes hours to get the lighting perfect. And you should see his gallery. It's fascinating.
And this also points out that the fibers themselves will take the ink differently than the base sheet. So often when you're adding, the more ink you add, the more the fiber will stand out against the base sheet.
Right. And
as you mentioned inks, can you use any traditional inks? Are they all printable on these papers?
Yeah, so these are all inkjet coated. So any inkjet printer, dye or pigment, will do just fine on these papers. And then, as with the Entrada and the other cotton papers, you can also embellish them after printing. Obviously, with the Unryu, especially, you want to be really careful with it because of its thin nature. But yes, in addition to, you can use any of your inkjets, and we have profiles for all the photo printers out there. And then you can do any handwork afterwards if you want to.
Right, so that was taken in fog in the Tiananmen Mountains in China. It's part of my China book. But the thing is, I also want to mention is Unryu is a sensitive paper. It's not the easiest thing to mount because it's 55 GSM, so it's quite thin, and you need to use a glue that will work with it. We tend to use that the Japanese washi paper producers recommend, we use a seaweed-based adhesive on it, which works very, very well. It doesn't show through the paper once it dries, and it's easy to work with. But the paper abrades easily, so you have to be careful and be gentle when you press it down, not to go too hard with your bone folder, or when you go to press it after you adhere, and while it's still damp, it can really abrade the paper. So be careful with that.
And then anything different if you're working with the Kozo?
No, the Kozo, even though it's double the GSM, 110 is still fairly light. It also has some translucency to it. So yeah, I mean, with the Kozo, we've had success with PVA glue as well as the seaweed glues. So yeah, that works. But I would not use the PVAs on the Unryu. I should test it, but I'm comfortable with the adhesives that we use.
And just to get to a couple of our questions here. So yes, the price of the Moenkopi papers is a bit higher than the Entradas, and that just owes to the nature of making a mulberry fiber traditional paper versus something that you can mass produce a lot more in a cotton or a cellulose base. Yes, UV glass is the same as museum glass. Typically, museum glass has a lower reflection. It's not a polished surface as much, but both of those, as long as the UV glass is, UV filtering, they will give you the same environmental protections. Karen is asking, when you say a larger image, what size is the smallest large image? Well, it again, just like you said, it does depend on the image itself, because these samples that I'm showing are they're on 8.5, 11 sheets, and some of these, they work out really well at this size. You could even go smaller, less, as you did with that holiday card. It's some trial and error in the beginning, and then once you've done some work with the papers, you kind of intrinsically know how to match image size and paper and all that sort of thing. So a little bit of practice is definitely the best way.
Right, absolutely.
For thin papers, do you need to adjust the platen gap? Generally, the media setting that we'll recommend, especially if it's a washi media setting or something like that, the printer's already anticipating a thin sheet. I haven't over the years had any loading issues or other printing issues because of the weight of the sheet, because again, the media setting will get the ink load set that you're not over inking the paper, so it's not going to ripple or other things like that. So no, typically I don't go in for a thick paper. I might have to increase the platen gap but for a thin paper, generally I don't decrease the platen gap. I don't know about you guys there.
Listen, well, I mean, I'll speak up on that. We never adjusted for the Unryu or the Kozo, and in fact, and this kind of surprises some people, we often get asked, "Can I do multiple sheets?" We generally, if we're doing a large print job, we'll put in 10 sheets of Unryu or Kozo, and maybe it's the effect of the printer itself. But we use the Canon Prograph printers, and they feed beautifully. But after, we do a lot of printing, so every maybe once a year, we just take some alcohol to the rollers and clean them off and from dust and so on, to make sure that they still can grab the paper properly. But other than that, yeah, it goes through no problem.
And have you ever used like a double-sided contact paper to mount either of these?
A double-sided contact paper? No, we have not. We do use a different washi paper that comes with a backing on it, and it's meant to be peeled, and it's very, very thin, 35 GSM. And
Right.
it's very, very touchy, very difficult to do. A lot of people, you end up with a lot of torn paper before you get
Yeah.
good at it.
So you've done the traditional framing without glazing,
Right.
but then I know you've also done kind of an extensive book project where you
Yes.
use these papers, and I want to kind of touch on that because I know it reminds us of the traditional scrolls or other things like that. So how did you incorporate that into the book? And I think you did talk about this at least in the newsletter for sure, but maybe in the ebook as well. You touched on this too if people want more information.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I actually today I'll be stitching the one of the books on China, we call it mountains, and I call it mountains in the mist, the Tiananmen Mountains of China. Uh, so these are one-off books, and we have an overlay on it. Um, of we use the Unryu as an overlay for each print. Uh, so it's really yeah, it's I wish I could show it to you. It's inside in a state of disassembly right now until I get to putting the folios together into signatures. But excuse me. Um, but yes, we use the Unreal often as a overlay sheet on some imagery because it has such a interesting effect. And we actually print some from a Chinese poet, we'll get into this hopefully in another video where I can go through the process. But if you go to our Substack, we're going to be we've already started, but we'll be releasing a series of articles, newsletters that track this process of how the book is built and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it was quite a project that you put together over time.
Yeah, it is. It is, and it's taken years actually, but there's a lot of other things to do. And
Right.
yeah, so fitting it in between is a challenge.
Yeah, the real work and then the fun work. You got to find that balance.
That's true. That's true. Yes.
And then also a couple of years ago on Luminous Landscape, I put the link in. There was a very in-depth technical review that included these two papers. So if you want to really drill into gamut and black point and tone curve and all that sort of thing, Mark did an excellent job in that review of really going deep on all the technical aspects of these papers and kind of much more in depth than the discussion we'll have today.
Well, if that's all of our questions, I think we'll wrap this up. And as usual, if you have any suggestions for future webinars, please let us know. We'll try to fit that in either end of this year or early next year. Any suggestions are helpful. And then we do have one more question before we close this out. Can these papers be dry mounted with heat and pressure?
I mean, yes, any paper can be dry mounted. With the Unryu especially, you'd want to make sure that it is really flat before you get it in there.
Yes.
And then when it comes to heat, we always say the less heat you apply, the better. And it's the inks that we are concerned about when it comes to heat, not the papers. And we haven't gotten a firm answer from any of the ink manufacturers as to what maybe there's a heat threshold. So I always advise, yeah, again, low temp as much as possible, just because you may not see a difference right away, but the more heat you apply to it, the more potential damage you could do to the long-term archival aspects of that. Again, we don't have any hard data on that, so it's just be conservative, but still achieve whatever you need to achieve. So a lower temp adhesive is going to be your best option.
So I mean, so many of the adhesives suggest a 210 degree for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. What are you hearing from these other sources?
I think there are some that are in the
150.
140, 160 range. If you can find something like that, I would absolutely recommend it. Again, we don't have we don't have data to work from. So it's
Right.
just, it's taking that conservative approach.
Yeah.
And also a vacuum mount, if you have access to that, is a great tool, because that just sandwiches everything together.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for joining us and for talking about these papers. This will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in a few days, so we will send an email when that is available. So thank you so much, Evan and Les.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah, happy to be here. And like I said, get the sample box between the two papers. You can look at all the links we have. Those go into depth about the differences between the short fiber, the long fiber, the thinner sheet, the thicker sheet. And then, yeah, absolutely, face mounting this to acrylic or sandwiching it between glass. There are a number of other mounting options that we haven't discussed, I think mainly because those are extremely difficult to do yourself. But there are a number of providers out there that do offer other mounting services and that sort of thing. In the New York office, I know we have a big face mounted piece of Unryu, and it's absolutely stunning because, again, you can offset that off the wall, get some backlight behind it, all that sort of thing. So there's a lot more options than we were able to touch on in this webinar, but absolutely, use all these tips and tools to get your hands on some of these Moenkopi papers and integrate those into what you're printing, because they really have a stunning and unique effect on your images.
Super.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and send in any questions or webinar suggestions or anything else. And thank you, Les, for joining us and your amazing work. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.